And so it now shows on everybody's window live on YouTube. And if you click on that, anybody who wants to copy a link and post it to anything so that your friends, relatives, and neighbors can watch you on the YouTubes in front of literally not even tens of people, ones of people, then you can do that. That'll be a fun thing to do. All right. And so it now shows. Did I hear somebody say something? Okay.
Oh, there it is.
And I don't know if I actually shared audio on that.
I think it came up right at the end there, but.
Okay, whatever. I need a Stream Deck and buttons. So welcome to the Audio Opinion Show. If you're here, thanks for coming. If you're not here, thanks for not coming. I guess you're not here, so you don't know. So this is where we basically have audio opinions about stuff. I'm going to do a real quick round robin of who we have here. Dave's a sound reinforcement guy. I'm a sound reinforcement guy. Bill's a sound reinforcement guy. Jesse's a sound reinforcement guy. Ike's a sound reinforcement guy, emphasis on wireless. Carl is a musician, emphasis on wireless, also did sound reinforcement. Keith is a sound reinforcement guy, I'm sensing a theme. Craig is more of a overall production guy. Michael's a sound enthusiast by his own definition. Victor's a musician and soundy kind of person. James is also a soundy person doing mostly production, not necessarily sound reinforcement. And Nathan is, more sound reinforcement-y kind of guy. Where did my polling go? There it is. Okay. So.
By the way, Jesse, the preview screen for the live feed is your mug. Like, you're famous now.
As
to that.
As it should be. All right, so the polls don't show up on YouTube, so I'm going to read this. So I just posted the poll, first poll, which is a practice poll. And that poll is, what's your favorite movie? There are two choices, The Princess Bride or some other horrible movie that isn't as good. So I see the answers are coming in now. I'm going to vote for what I will vote for. And we'll end it there and we'll share the results. And see,
close.
Princess Bride. Princess Bride still wins because who wants to really watch some other horrible movie that isn't as good? I mean, that's a no-brainer.
Inigo Montoya.
You kill my father, prepare to die. Absolutely. Okay, so now let's hit topic one. I'm going to launch this guy. So topic one, some of these will be familiar for folks. These are our 6 options. 48K versus 96K versus 192K. Bottom snare mic, essential or stupid? Do we like on-off mics, on-off buttons on our consoles, or mute buttons? Somebody's microphone is open and going in the background. SM58s versus anything but an SM58. A mono PA versus a stereo PA versus an LCR PA. Or let's talk protocols of audio transmission over IP-ish things. Dante versus Maddie versus ES50 versus Giga Ace versus whatever else you like. And I'm going to, without looking at anything else, vote, because I got called out last time by Carl when I said, I'm going to vote honestly this time. And he's like, what? You're usually not honest? So, okay. We'll share the results, and it looks like we're going to be talking sample rates today, kids. 48K versus 96K versus 192K. So it's all about sample rates, digital sample rates. Does it matter? Do we care? What's the difference? What's the deal? Anybody care to jump in immediately?
Yeah, one issue I have when it comes to sample rates is I use a lot of plugins, Melodyne, Auto-Tune, and I'm curious as to what artifacts occur at lower sample rates versus higher. You know, you're obviously paying a price with throughput and storage, but the benefits of higher sample rates, I'm trying to figure out from a composer perspective.
Well, and have you, like, do you do you have any experience like one way or the other? Like, oh, when I tried it at this, it was this, or when I tried it at this, it was this?
I've had the artifacts and I've tried it at higher sample rates. And to tell you the truth, I'm at the point where I just want some other opinions because.
So you're like, I think I heard something weird, but I'm not sure I heard something weird.
Yep.
That's that. Go ahead.
My 2 cents worth on that is a question, I guess. Do you clock everything to a master word clock, or how are you handling your?
No, I'm working on a Max workstation with Logic Pro. It's pretty
Okay.
basic.
So all this is happening inside of a box?
It's all in the box.
Okay, gotcha.
What's your audio interface?
Well, I'm actually moving over from a Sapphire to a Universal Audio. So are you talking about my AD converter?
Yep.
But then does it make a difference with regards to like when you set up your project? Like, is that kind of the question? Like, oh, if I set up my project in 96K or I set up my project in 48K, like does that, what does that do? Carl is nodding. So he knows. Carl is a guy who knows things. So I'm gonna let him talk to this for a second.
Well, I would just start by saying that I was at a demonstration several years ago now, maybe even more than a decade, but most of us there were convinced that you could hear some subtle differences between 48 kilohertz, 96 kilohertz, and a live mic feed. We had some Sennheiser MKH 500 or 50 mics. These were I forget the model number now, but these are mics that go to 50 kilohertz. And we had a live piano and a live acoustic guitar. So they're piping this feed in through some high-end preamps. We listened over a really nice system. And it's hard to say what the artifacts were. I mean, Craig, when you say artifacts, I'm gonna get to that, but I'm gonna ask you about what those things are that you're hearing. I wouldn't have said that there was artifacts with the 16-bit, 48K, but the 96 sounded closer to the live mic feed. But nothing,
well, and Carl, not to interrupt you, but when you say live mic feed, like that was like analog.
Yeah, analog live mic feed through preamps into a playback system. It was a very minimalized system designed basically to show that you could hear differences in certain circumstances. Most of us agreed, yeah, you could hear some differences. But the question becomes, what's it worth? And Craig, to your point about probably for you with your projects going at the higher sample rates, you've got storage issues. I mean, the files become rather large. 24-bit, 96 or 192 kilohertz or 98K, 192 become very large. And that's certainly an issue. But in my experience, quantizing is where I hear artifacts much more than I hear it with sample rates. I feel like, 48 kilohertz is high enough that there shouldn't be any obvious artifacts in the audio in most circumstances. But quantizing, if you don't have enough signal to noise on your input signal, that kind of thing, and you're trying to then raise that signal up, you're going to start to hear crap, down at the bottom of the bit range. But that's just been my experience.
So,
Well, I'm sorry, Victor, you're muted, Victor.
oh, thank you. I'm muted.
Now you're on.
I'm okay. Yep. So my question becomes that recently I've been getting into this whole video thing and live streaming and creating some videos, and 48 is the standard there. On my music side of the house, I really haven't ever used 48, and so my question and concern becomes, if I now start using 48 for some of my music related stuff, I'm going to run into some issues if I ever want to do something on a CD, because if I go back to 44.1 and sample it down, I'm going to lose some stuff there, right?
Yeah, you might have artifacts with downsampling.
Exactly.
The latest algorithms are pretty clean, but you want to avoid it if you can, which is another whole issue, is resampling. And in the live world, resampling adds latency. So, I mean, in general, I often advocate that you should resample as little as possible. And so use the highest common denominator. If 48K is the highest sample rate that all your equipment, can be set to, then that's the rate that you want to use. If you're going back and forth from 96 to 48 or to some other sample rate, you're incurring resampling and latency. And you may, pay a little bit of an audio price. It might be subtle, but it's there.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carl, but like if I downsample from 96 to 48, I'm essentially throwing out every other sample.
Generally,
which
yes.
is so at that point, it's, you know, the chances of there being artifacts are less than if I'm going 48 to 44.1, because now something is interpolating between those things to create a different sampling rate.
Exactly right.
So I'm having to like change my workflow around now and just being really cautious or aware of, you know, what is it that I'm going, what is my end state in my universal audio. I'm having to do more saving of setups. So, hey, I'm going to be doing a live stream or a Zoom. Let's set everything up for 48. I get my clocking from an envelope, a discrete unit. So then I have to sync that up. And it's just, I'm having to put a little more forethought to what's going to be the end state of this piece of audio. Video, or is it going to be more on the music side, and then change accordingly?
So how do you guys define artifacts? Because what Craig was talking about, if you're switching between sampling rates and you turn up with some sort of noise, I would think on a Mac using Logic, that's going to be your buffering, and it's not going to be doing anything to do with your sample rate.
You know,
But what Carl was talking about, when you're in a live mic and you hear a difference between 48 and 96 in a live mic. When you say artifacts in that situation, are you talking about like sound and noise, or what are you talking about that you're hearing?
right.
Aside from detail.
Yeah, I would define an artifact as anything that sounds unnatural, anything that pulls you out of the experience. And so there are visual artifacts like in a JPEG where you have noise, and there are audio artifacts in where all of a sudden you hear a glitch or something. And now, mind you, I'll give you an example. I've worked with singers from Fiverr and other sources, and they supply me with an audio file that I plug into a composition. The question I need as far as format, you would think, the more information, the better. So higher bit depth rate, would that be better? Should I request that? If I need to make some corrections and fix things, and all of a sudden in the course of making those corrections, I hear glitches, things that sound unnatural, my primary question is, what format would optimize that? Where's the sweet spot? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the answer is the same answer to all of these questions, which is it depends.
Yeah, always.
It's it's funny. We've done several of these things now. We've talked about like mic pre's. We've talked about latency. We've talked about a lot of different things that are very subjective, and it really a lot of times comes down to the situation. Like, I'm actually glad that the first part of this conversation was very heavily not sound reinforcement, because we have typically a lot of sound reinforcement guys on here. However, I'm going to pivot to Dave, because I know that he works with different kinds, and I like a lot of the Digico stuff is 96K or 190. Do they do a 190? Yeah. The Yamaha stuff is kind of standardized at 48 because they can. Thoughts?
Well, it kind of exactly like you're saying, it all depends on the system that you're running, and then keeping it the same. So, for example, if you're doing Yamaha and Dante and everything else at 48, you're then going into, let's say you're going into a lake. You have to keep in mind that a lake is only going to push out 48. But I use a lot of Martin gear with a certain audio company, and if you push
a local company that shall remain nameless,
so you push it through the Martin processors, and its output will be 96. It will up step to 96 anything you put into it. You cannot change that in that, which is kind of very interesting. So you have to do a really good job of knowing what you're doing throughout your system and your signal flow. And then, if things are too different, connect a clock to it. Make sure everything is clocked to the same clock.
Well, then I guess, the other question would be like, again, and I show my own simpletonness here, but going from 48 to 96, you're essentially, you just double it. You just say everything twice. Like, you just kind of double the sample. So I guess, there's not a quote unquote loss there, but there's not really a gain other than they just are able to then run their whole system at 96. Now, have you had situations where you're running, you know, a Digico or something, basically where you're 96 end to end, and you've been able to go, oh yeah, no, that was different, better.
No.
No.
There you go. That's a good answer. That's a really good answer. Like,
In live,
no.
Yeah.
in live reinforcement, you're talking, at least I'm talking like arena size and amphitheater size. There's no one, and I don't care how good ears you have, you're not going to notice a difference in that. You're going to notice a difference in maybe how a plugin is working, whether it's running at 48 or 96 in a set of headphones through the desk, but in the system, in the audience, no.
You don't think you're when you're up at 96 in a live system that your reverb tails are not going to show up better? You're not going to hear a better tail out at 96?
I would think there'd be a bigger difference between, let's say, 16 bits and 24 bits versus a higher sample rate for things like reverb tables. Again, that's where you get better quantizing accuracy, you know, with a greater number of bits.
Educate us, oh wise one, in a paragraph or less, quantizing.
That's the process of converting the analog to digital in terms of the steps in the dynamic range. You know, 16-bit has, I forget, 65,000 steps, and you know, 24-bit has, I forget, millions.
Millions,
so
right?
It's much, you know, you get, you know, lower lows and higher highs in terms of dynamic range, and a fighter gradation in between. So you can capture things like real subtle, you know, reverb tails and things like that with greater, you know, number of bits. Sample rate, you know, once you get well past the range of human hearing, it gets very difficult to distinguish the difference between those sample rates in most circumstances.
So is it fair to say, and some of this is knocking the rust off of my own brain, that sample rate is more frequency dependent, and sample size is more dynamic range, basically?
Yes,
more
yeah.
samples
In a nutshell, that's right.
in a nutshell. You know, not that there's not nuance to that, obviously, but
right, sample size, you mean bit depth is
Bit depth
more
is
accurate
dynamic
way to
range.
describe
Right.
that.
Bit depth
Sorry.
is dynamic range.
What would you say your dynamic range is, though, in general, of a live concert scenario between the noise floor of the crowd and the maximum output of the PA? You probably have,
And all the compression in line, and
I mean, it doesn't matter if you got 100+ dB of dynamic range in your system. You're dealing with like a 70 something dB noise floor anyway. So it's like 40 dB of dynamic range in that you have to work with in a live situation if you're talking about mixing a rock concert.
Yeah, and that's what Dave was saying. I mean, you know, it's what can you really hear in a live show with all of these subtleties, and most of that kind of stuff is going to be lost. I think
I agree.
You know, the key really is if you're going to be processing the signal a lot, better bit depth and better sample rate helps you. You've got more detail to work with, more resolution, and as you're shaping that, you know, and clipping things away, it's similar in photography, and that's where I learned these concepts. You know, if you start out with a very high resolution scan and great bit depth, you can work that image and not start to have the artifacts. You know,
yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. In that analogy, NASCAR events, and I think Brian, you may have been the one who told me this, but a lot of that stuff camera-wise is 8K, and they're framing down to get what they want on the screen. It's not necessarily the full camera image. It's what they decide to pick out and follow around when it's going around the track. So, yeah, obviously, the more you have to start with, you can clip away without as many deleterious effects. So
ultimately, you know, the more is better.
I'm sorry.
Except when it's not.
So in a live sound situation, sorry, we're talking. I just would like. How come we haven't standardized at 24-bit 96K and just across the board in systems? Why do we? Why is there even a question of even going to 16-bit or 24-bit when 24-bit is, in my experience, usually sounds better?
Definitely.
And,
well, I think 24-bit has been the
sounds
standard. It's the sample rate issue has to do with data rates, And if you start having a lot of lines coming in all at 192 and 24 bits, that's an enormous amount of data. So I think we're going to eventually get there. Right now, I feel like 48K 24-bit is sort of the standard and is kind of the sweet spot.
Okay.
But, you know, the one advantage of the higher sample rates is lower latency on A to D and D to A. So you can understand why PA systems and mixing consoles are going to want to go at a higher sample rate, plus the processing headroom that you have, like we talked about. But we'll see. I mean, I think we're still in the infancy of digital, honestly. We're in the first couple decades and we got a long ways to go.
Yeah, I think we're still trying to figure out what the you know, what the best trade-offs are, because ultimately that's what we're talking about. Even in today's day of, you know, extremely high processing power compared to, you know, even 5 years ago, it's still finite. Like there's still a finite amount of, and it's like, do I want to burn all of my computing just parsing through, you know, 192K of, like, you know, 3/4 of that is probably above dog hearing range. And so it's like I'm burning an awful lot of compute time just to, you know, deal with frequency ranges that no one can hear. Am I better off putting that processing into a really amazing modeler of C6, or you know, a really amazing plugin, or a way to get the latency down even farther, because, you know, I can, you know, so that's I mean, that's the trade-off that we're talking about.
Right.
Yep.
I think that
And
there's,
If we're
there's always
not
been a,
hearing this, if we're not hearing the stuff, like I see specs all the time that bring it up to 48 kilohertz. Well, you know, more than double what we can hear. What's the point of using that? What is that providing to the baseline that we can hear, when 99% of the people going to your concerts probably don't hear above 16K? Or if they do, it's very minimal from 16 to 20.
Well, don't forget though that the sample rate is always going to be double your highest possible frequency minus your high pass or your low pass filtering. So 48 kilohertz yields a 24 you know, kilohertz actual frequency response audio wise, and then you've got to build in some filtering. So it brings it to, let's say, you know, good clean response up to 22 kilohertz, which is, like you said, more than you really need, but not by that much.
Right, there's
and
online, there's a few good like Pepsi challenge type blind tests where you can compare audio. Now this isn't talking about processing and you know, with plugins and stuff, but just like end results of different sample rates and bit depths. And I was very surprised, as somebody who's been critically listening to music and running sound for years, at how much you could get away with. I mean, they would bit crush these things down below 16 bits, and it's still, you have to really listen to even hear differences. I mean, I'll admit, I can't hear the difference between a high quality MP3 and a WAV file. And this was listening on headphones, you know, in a controlled environment or on studio monitors. I think
it's true for most people. I would agree. I think perceptual coding has gotten very, very good. And, you know, we have some limited pipelines for the playback in most cases. And I've done those tests myself. I agree with you. I had a hard time telling the difference.
And a lot of times I
some
think
of that may be source material related too.
Yeah, people
well,
focus
something
on
nobody's addressed. Something that no one talks about these days is the analog electronics before and after the AD to DA converters. Like there's talk of reverb tails. I've done some experiments in analog electronics, and I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that slew rate is huge. And in one particular thing I was working on, I substituted an op amp that had a very, very high slew rate, and before and after, you could hear a really noticeable difference in the reverb tails on this part. And then we found another place in the circuit where we could put another one of those, and you could hear it even longer extension of the reverb tails. And that made such a dramatic change that the entire song would have had to have been remixed at that point. So if you're using mediocre analog electronics to get into a 24-bit sampling rate, in and out of a 24-bit sampling rate, then things like reverb tails and all that stuff are going to fall off anyway. So there's more than just the sample rate is part of the equation, and that's part of the whole issue with equipment manufacturing these days. Is partly particularly in the uber digital world, are the people that are designing the analog electronics on either end of it knowledgeable in what actually sounds good and why. And the other thing is whether the manufacturer is willing to spend the money on those parts to make it sound good.
Yeah, well, and I think, I mean, you touched right at the end on a huge part of it, which is, putting 192K processing throughput on your marketing materials is an easy thing for people to grok and kind of get their head around. But we use really, really good analog stuff doesn't really resonate. Oh, we use 1694A op amps or whatever. I made that up. It doesn't really resonate. People can't really. So because of that, you end up with, let's face it, marketing controls an awful lot of what we do. I will say to touch on what Nathan said as well. This is a rabbit trail that I promise I won't make us go down. It's a different conversation, but part of the reason why I keep putting in my SM58 or anything but an SM58 is because one of the things that I've noticed, having been in the business since like the late 80s, early 90s, is that in sound reinforcement, I mean, the PA couldn't do 12K. Like it wasn't going to come out of the speakers. So it's like the analog stuff would all do it, but the PA wasn't going to make it. And so it kind of didn't matter. And we started getting, better and better PAs, but we also, people, started gravitating towards brighter and brighter microphones because they would emphasize the highs some, which would overcome a little bit of that. I'm kind of coming back around now to, I want less and less bright microphones on stage. I want less and less high-end reproduction on stage because the PA will make the sound. And now I feel like overall, like I've got too much 13K in the mix. There's a part of me that's like, just give me my 48K. Like sample rate. Cause it's certainly in sound reinforcement. I don't want that. It's now I have too much of it. Like you've given me too much of it. And now I want to dial back my transducers just to turn it down a little bit.
No higher sample rate, I think, is actually giving you audible high frequency extension, because I can't hear above 16K, and lots of you guys are older than me. You probably can hear less than that. So I don't think that there's any high frequency extension is this, kind of audiophile magic airiness that's up there at 20K plus. It's not something that's audible.
Yeah. It's like going to 11.
It's not necessarily extension though, Jesse. Like sometimes, and I have an example of a friend was, I made this kind of DI box for him to play tunes through on this PA. It was an S6L. And this track that he was playing, when he played it one way, it was like there was some sort of kind of sound going on there, and you knew it was part of the music. And when you played it through the better electronics, you go, oh, that's a shaker. So sometimes it's not just the high frequency extension, but it's also the high frequency definition can change. And so again, you knew that there was some part in the music. Sorry, go ahead.
But you're not talking about listening through at different sample rates. You're talking about listening through different analog hardware. now, right?
Well, yeah, this was analog hardware, but the analogy is the same, and that sometimes what you would call high frequency extension might just be better definition at high frequencies because of the higher sample rate and that kind of thing. And so again, it's the difference between knowing that there's something in the track that's going and going, oh yeah, that's a shaker. And you know, those kinds of high transient response things are notoriously difficult to record, even to get hi-hats, tambourines, that kind of stuff are difficult to record because of the amount of transient information at high frequencies. I just want
I don't want to
that-
sound too skeptical, but send me the audio recordings of the shaker at 48K and the shaker at 96K, and I'll see if I can tell the difference. But I am a bit skeptical of this stuff, and I think even if there is a difference, I think a lot of people fixate on this because it's easy to market with just, you know, numbers. And I think the bottleneck in quality of a lot of productions, live or studio, people are fixating on, you know, things like preamps and sample rates. It's debatable whether they matter or not, but it's not the bottleneck in the quality of your crappy recording a lot of the times, for especially guys that are first getting into it and they want to focus on their preamps and the sample rates. And it's like, there's so many other big moves you can make to make your stuff sound better before you get down to this like garnishments. I just think people kind of put the cart before the horse a lot.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's and we when we first get into this, we get really, really tweaky about all this nonsense. And I think back even like in the dark ages, and it's like, oh yeah, no, my drum overhead, I've got to have a small diaphragm condenser, and it's got to be an SM81, or it's got to be a this, or it's got to be right. You know, meanwhile, my PA was just howling at like 250. You know, and you know, but I'm like fixated on, oh, my overheads have to be a certain, and it's like
you're running through some pile of PV junk at a club for drunk people.
But you know, Jesse's so right. I have clients, you know, that come to me and, oh, you know, I want to have that airy thing on my vocals, and I'm just like, okay, and you know, they're not going to be able to hear that at all. And you're right, marketing contributes to that, because now we have interfaces that are sold with, it has air, turn a button on for air and that kind of stuff. I just think it gets a little silly because most people can't hear it. And then you get people that are saying, oh yeah, but you can feel it, you can perceive it. I think that's bunk.
Yeah, well, I will say, like, I've been, sorry, Nathan, I'm interrupting you. Ha, I win. Sorry, man. I like my own little, like, dirty little secret that I'm now old enough and don't care enough to actually say is I've never been able to hear the difference between all this like golden ear stuff. And I've been on gigs with Bill Mills where he's been like, oh man, we did that thing and man, everything just opened up. I believe he heard it. I believe he's right. I could not hear it. Like, you know, and I've managed to still get a fairly decent career in audio as pretty average, probably hearing. Like I don't have the golden ears that go to dog whistle level or whatever, or, you know, or I hear the difference, but yeah, you know, it's like, I hear the difference, like, oh, this one's different than that one, but they both sound fine to me. Like,
as Albert Einstein famously never said, 0 kilohertz is okay by me.
I see what you did there.
So
Keith, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting only because there's a couple people whose voices I don't think I've heard. Keith, have you weighed in on this at all?
I have not. And part of me sits here and thinks back to the 80s and the late 70s when I first started this crap. I didn't start this crap, but when I first started in this crap, and agree with you, Brian, that our PA systems were really crap back then. They didn't go up to, you know, 20K for sure. We were lucky if they went up to 15. And I can remember taking, you know, piezo's and putting 4 of them in a box and cross them over at 15K and saying, oh yeah, I hear that, right? Like, yeah, no, we didn't hear that. We thought we did. But the other thing that I see is we're all sitting here saying, oh, 96K, whatever sample rates and bit depth is the thing that makes the big difference, at least in recording in the studio for sure. Live, I'm not so sure, because I think it's more the source that gives you the dynamics, right? If the band is just, a metal band coming at you at 110 dB off the stage, there is no dynamics, right? If you've got maybe some bass or something going on, then you might get your 40, 45 dB, dynamic range. But what we're seeing today is a whole different thing. What are the kids listening to, right? I mean, not just the music that they're listening to, but how are they listening to it? So we're sitting here as guys in the audio field saying, oh, sample rate and this and that, and the other thing, and getting these details of the reverb tail. You think the kid walking down the street listening through his iTunes, one of his MP3, listening to the earbuds, is really listening to that tail? No, he's not listening to that reverb tail. He's listening to the beat.
Well, there's that whatever that infamous picture is, but it's basically the signal chain of like $1 million studio, $1 million processing, all crammed down into your 96 sample rate MP3 into your earbuds. And I mean, much to what Carl said, just like photography, starting with the best possible thing you can start with, definitely there's not really a downside. I mean, to really draw a very loose metaphor, when video went HD, all of the television shows that had been shot on 35 millimeter film were suddenly like the smartest guys ever, because they could go back to the prints, which were very high quality, even though they were only television shows, and they were going to be broadcast at crap, basically, 480i or whatever. But they had shot it on 35 millimeter, and in some cases had even shot it to 16:9 safe. And so all of a sudden, the ones that hadn't done that, they kind of they lost out on a lot of syndication stuff, and the ones that had. And so you do wonder, again, in the recording field, whether there's some value to, we're going to push the as high as we can, because maybe someday it will matter. Like maybe once we get the brain implant, that like you just stick the spike in the side of your ear and it just like magically makes the waves go into your brain at a million K, then maybe we'll be glad we recorded it that way. I do think that in the in the sound reinforcement world, we're not there.
Well, I agree. Brian, I agree with you. I mean, I do some recording as well, and I'm recording at higher sample rates and higher bit depths and stuff like that, just mostly to please myself and my client, right? If my client cares about it, then I care about it for sure. But if my client doesn't care about it, I'm still doing it for myself, and just like I'm out there mixing shows, like you guys are, right? If you're out there doing a live show, you're mixing it to the best of your ability. For yourself, but also because, you want to keep your job, right?
There is that.
Brian, I've got to go, but I want to leave everybody with this. If you know anybody with synesthesia, I would love to see if they can see the sound that we're thinking we're perceiving above 20.
Oh, that would be an interesting
great thought, Victor.
Yeah, I would love to talk to somebody. Yeah. So, anyways, I'll leave you with that. It was great to be here. I've got another meeting.
Cool. See you, Victor.
Bye now.
Can I say if
maybe I can get him?
So Michael is weighing in. I was just getting ready to call his name anyway. So by all means, weigh in.
I said I better weigh in right now. One of the things that I see that is very important, when you hear young people listen to music, what you hear is a lot of bass. And they love bass. And you can hear cars shouting and rumbling and all and I don't call that music. I just call that distortion. What has happened is that when you went from having a pipeline where individuals could put MP3s in and they could put a lot of music into a particular machine, and they now are just stacking music instead of listening to music. My ability to stack more cuts that I can put in a ear thing that I could play, or some kind of recorder, is more important than me listening to the music. But as we increase bandwidth, like 5G, as the internet gets better until we go into like a fiber cable and stuff, I think these bit rates are going to be important, because now you can be able to hear music at its best. For example, Tidal has replaced in what they call high fidelity with the CD. People listen to CD music now, and they call that high fidelity, because they've been listening to so much junk that's been broadcast just because they want to reproduce the music. You remember when these services came in where you could copy music in the audio? They would use
all the Napsters and all those guys. Yep.
File sharing.
Once they came in and people got on the internet and saying that, look, I could get this song on the internet, don't have to pay for it, I can do this. The quality of music went way down. And but I think that as we begin to have efficient pipelines like 5G, the internet, and broadcasting, I think that people, with the conversation that we're having now, needs to know that, because then you can distinguish between what you're hearing. Because
there's no shortage of bandwidth to stream high quality, high bit rate, high sample rate audio. I mean, you were streaming ultra HD 4K movies. Like, I don't think
that's also a matter of where you live too. I mean, we live in a pretty high-tech area, and that kind of bandwidth is easily accessible here. You live out in the rural spaces somewhere, and you're like depending on satellite for internet. You may not have that luxury.
But not listening to MP3s because there's not adequate bandwidth for them to stream high definition wave files. That's just not true.
It started that way, though. It started that way. This goes back. I mean, MP3s go back to a time where this was not the standard. That a gig service at your house was not even something people were considering at the time. So it goes back to a time. And we've also changed the way we consume music too. I mean, it's not, obviously back in the day, albums were the way you went, and that's the way it was available to you. Now you can buy all your music a la carte, or you rent music now. Basically, nobody buys music anymore; it's all rented for the most part. So, I
mean, it goes to the bigger kind of, and I'm close to wrapping this, because one, we're rabbit trailing down something that I'm probably going to make another topic, because it's interesting how has consumption of music changed how we should be making music, because it has changed completely. One of my friends put up on Facebook, when was the last time that you put on headphones and listened to an entire album? And when I was coming up, like, that was a thing we did. Like, I listened to The Wall a bunch,
well, that explains
2 hours. Yeah, 2 hours, and it's like that's just not something that's done. But then, then the question, inevitably comes, but will it come back? And I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and close this, because some of us were here extra long, and I appreciate that. I will do a better job the next one of these of starting on time and not backing it right up against somebody else's meeting that a lot of people I know are in. Any last thoughts on this particular topic?
I just throw my 2 cents in with what Ike was saying about the quality of analog outputs, and op amps, and how all that makes a difference. I mean, I can tell you, I don't have a whole lot of firsthand experience with this. I'm talking from, things I've heard secondhand. A lot of people said the PM5D was a great console, but if you can keep it in the digital world, you're much better off not even having to do that conversion. And ran a system one time where the guy that runs 5Ds all the time and works with the band that we were working with all the time, and we had done ether sound out of the console to a network bridge that converted it to AES. And the guy looked at me and said, "What the hell did you do to this console? I've never heard a 5D sound like this before." So there is something to be said for, what place the analog fits into the 96K. it's a cumulative effect basically. All this stuff adds up. Yeah.
And there's also, and also how many times it happens.
Yeah.
How many IOs you go through, how many
conversions you go through. Absolutely. Yep. And but yeah, the quality of the analog electronics in that obviously played a role because, and we locked the console to a big bend at 96K, so the digital stage was running at that clock rate. So you obviously whatever benefits you would gain from that. But yeah, I've also heard that before. It's like the difference of kick drum on a console that's running, or at least from that vintage anyway, that's running on an external word clock. That's
all right. Now Bill's talking about external word clocks, which is another topic that's on my list. So,
but it has to do with the sample rate.
No, you're just. He's like, I want to go down another rabbit trail. I've known Bill for a while. I know that external word clocks are one of his things that he and I probably disagree with. So that'll be fun for the future. Yeah. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you guys for coming. Thanks for the guys who stayed a little bit longer. Thanks for the guys. Scott, did I miss you, Scott?
Yeah, I've been trying to talk for 30 minutes.
Oh man, I'm so sorry. No,
it's no big deal.
No.
Anyway.
Put your hand up if I miss you. I had my list here and I just looked down and there's no check mark next to Scott. I apologize, please.
It's not a big deal. I actually wrote down what I want to say. Anyway, there were just a couple of things that came up because we started off discussing going from a lower sampling rate to a higher sampling rate and then going backwards. Well, a couple of things. It's not just the Nyquist impact that you get the increased frequency response at 96 kilohertz. When you go to the higher bit rates, you're pushing the anti-aliasing way up out of the audio range. So the term artifact was used early on. That's the kind of smearing that you can hear when during the quantization, you get that shifting sound because you're out of bit depth, which is something else. But once you push that outside the audible range, mathematically, you've got room to do more in the audible range. And then we talked about effects, and that's the same thing. We don't know if the bit buckets or however they're doing the effect, if they're having a zero stuff or whatever they got to do their magic, if they're doing non-boundary sampling changes, because if you don't keep it on the 8K boundaries, now you have this interpolation thing that has to go on that we talked about, going from CD rate up to 48 kilohertz. So all those things together, having that extra bandwidth, if you're going to move around in sampling rate, run it through different devices that may be doing resampling internally, it pushes a lot of the artifacts outside the audible range and gives the algorithms, the math, room to do that outside the audible space. I hope that was coherent enough.
I apologize.
Why didn't he speak up earlier?
Because we were all yelling. We were all interrupting because I told everybody, feel free to interrupt, and then everybody did. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to everybody on YouTube. So say goodbye to everybody on YouTube. Goodbye, everybody on YouTube.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.